When I first got into writing fiction some 20 years ago, I felt like I was a decent enough writer on a line by line level, but I grossly underestimated how difficult writing narrative fiction was going to be. A lot of my writing up to that point had been technical writing, which very often is a no nonsense approach to writing with a purpose to convey ideas and steps or procedures as economically and effectively as possible. We're trained outside of fiction writing to organize and present information in a logical manner. Writing stories is sort of the opposite of that. Instead of providing information, narrative fiction is more about the posing of story questions and the dramatic withholding of the answers to hook the reader, get them invested in your story, and keep them reading until the end. As you can imagine, I quickly realized I needed help. Lots of it. Some of that help came from attending writing workshops, some came from critiquing and being critiqued in various writing groups, more came through conventions and mingling and just talking about the craft and business of writing. And just as a quick aside, I think I'm going to create a video on each of those things, how to critique and get the most out of a writing group like that, and also how to get the most out of a convention that you might go to. But a good amount of my education on narrative fiction writing came through books. And in order to help you along your journey, I thought I'd share some of the books that helped me the most. One quick caveat. I chose these books in part because I had certain weaknesses. You may not have those same weaknesses, and so you may not get the same value out of these that I did. That said, even if you're already strong in one area of writing, it helps to reinforce your strengths. We can always get better. You may get a perspective on some aspect of writing you hadn't considered before, and it helps deepen your understanding of the craft. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you for sharing, subscribing, and liking the channel and these videos. One of my goals for A Novel Approach was to grow large enough to join the YouTube Partner Program, and in just a few months, I've reached their requirements, applied, and been approved. That's thanks to you, so I wanted to take a moment to say I really appreciate your support. I'd also like to make one special appeal. Gaining organic traffic on YouTube definitely helps, but one way you could help is by sharing the channel with writers groups in particular, either those you formed on social media, communities you're part of on Reddit, Discord, or maybe in-person critique groups. If you could share the channel with a quick plug, it would do a lot to expand the audience and, I hope, give your fellow writers some valuable advice. All that said, let's dive into my top 10 books on writing. If you've watched any of my videos, you might have picked up on the fact that I like to organize things. It's easy to miss, I know. I've broken these down not by order of preference or anything like that. It's more about where you might use these books in the process of writing. And so the first three are geared more towards a holistic view of writing, and so you might read these early on to gear up for a new novel. The middle four are more about the guts of writing and what you should be paying attention to on a day-to-day basis as you're in the writing process itself. The last three are geared more towards after the writing is done and perhaps the editing process. Now, anything you do in the editing process, you should be doing in the writing process itself, but it's difficult to find those things early on, especially as a newer writer. Some of these books I have mentioned in other videos, but you may not have seen all of them, and so I'm pulling these all together into one presentation. The first one is Writing the Breakout Novel by Donald Maass. Don is a literary agent who's been in the field for a long time. He has written some fiction himself. He has also written quite a few books on writing and some workbooks as well that kind of go along with it. So I believe there's a workbook that goes with this and some of his other books on writing. But this one, Writing the Breakout Novel, is great. Don pulled together a number of breakout novels, including some of those from authors he reps, and analyzed them and tried to figure out what lessons could be learned from those breakout successes and how you can apply that to your own writing. This book does have some information on how to be a writer in general, the writer's life, that sort of thing, but its biggest strengths come from analyzing those breakout novels and really trying to figure out what makes them tick. And I think he does a really good job of it. And this is where that tension on every page video came from that I put out recently. So you can take a look at that to get a feel for part of what this book is getting at. The second book is Techniques of the Selling Writer by Dwight Swain. This is a really good book that covers the writer's life from beginning the ideation stage, brainstorming, plotting, through writing, editing, and getting published. It's kind of a nuts and bolts front to end look at the writer's life. Now, this book was published in 1965, and so the market information contained in here is very dated, and in fact, the examples that Swain gives are also dated. They're kind of a Mad Men style view of what stories should and shouldn't be and what's successful and what isn't. If you can ignore that and get past that, there's a lot of solid advice in here, and I highly recommend this book. The third book is Nancy Kress's Beginnings, Middles, and Ends. I actually attended a workshop with Nancy at Clarion in Michigan a number of years ago. She was a great teacher. She's also a brilliant writer, and she writes clearly and concisely when she's trying to convey messages about fiction. She has a number of books on writing, but I really like this one because it talks about what the beginning should do, the sort of promises that you're making in the opening of a book, and how you complicate those, expand on those in the middle, and how you fulfill them by the end of the book. And so it's a really good view of what those three parts, and you could consider them Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, should accomplish in your stories. So those were 3 books that covered writing kind of from a high, holistic level. Now we're going to get into 4 books that kind of get into the weeds and cover the nuts and bolts of writing. This book by Noah Lukeman, the first 5 pages, was pretty illuminating for me, and it does cover what you should do in the first 5 pages, but really the implication is the things that you do in the first 5 pages are the things that you should do in the next 5 pages, and the next 5, and the next 5. And one of the eye-opening sequences for me was agents and editors also know that instinctively, and that can be a negative if your story isn't up to snuff. So what I'm getting at here is the things that they see and pick up on in the first 5 pages, they know are going to show up in the next 5 and the next 5. And so this book is kind of a cautionary tale. You have to be really careful about what you present, and learning to do that well in the first 5 pages should carry on throughout the rest of the book. And so this is a really interesting look at just how much you should pay attention to the words you're putting down and what you're removing as well, so you can leave the good stuff. Less is more in fiction, very, very often. And so, really good book. The 5th book is Scene and Structure by Jack Bickham. This is the basis of the video that I did on the structure of scenes. And it's a really good look at how you should structure your scenes, from the statement of some goal on the part of the protagonist or the viewpoint character, to the introduction and development of conflict, to some kind of disaster at the end, which moves the story forward. The 6th book on writing is Setting, also by Jack Bickham. And this, by the way, is part of the Elements of Fiction writing from Writer's Digest. I have found these books in general to be very high quality. You can't go wrong, I think, with getting any number of these books. And I have a number of them in this video, including Beginnings, Middles, and Ends, Scene and Structure, Setting, and the next one coming up. So Setting is great because it is a major part of what you're going to be doing in your fiction writing, but the setting itself should be minimized to a degree, but also have purposes beyond describing what the world around the characters look like. A couple of my favorite chapters in here are chapters 7 and 8. Chapter 7 is how to use setting to advance plot. So setting is not just setting. You should be using that and constructing your setting, where you place your scenes, and how you leverage that setting throughout the action in the scene to advance the plot. And then chapter 8 is how setting affects character. And that talks about how setting is related to character, where they like to go, places they don't like to go, for example. The words that you're using to describe setting can do a lot more than describe the world around them. It can talk about plot, character, and more. Those are just a couple of examples of what makes this book so good. I highly recommend this one to enhance how you're describing the setting around the characters. The 7th book is Conflict, Action, and Suspense by William Noble. I mentioned early on, and in the video I did on tension, that tension on every page is one of my mantras, and this book was great to introduce different types of tension. And all 3 of these, conflict, action, and suspense, those are types of tension. And so in order to expand your awareness of what tension is and how you can use different types of it in your fiction, I recommend this book. Now, I mentioned the last 3 books are kind of tailored towards the editing stages, the post stage where you're working on what you've written, which leads to the 8th book, which is a very commonly recommended book on writing. It's kind of a pocket book on writing that I would recommend to any writer. It's short. You should read it from front to end to get a better sense of what you should and shouldn't do on a line-by-line level. So this is Strunk and Dwight's Elements of Style. Grab it, digest it, use it every day in your writing. Now, the 9th book comes from having read and critiqued hundreds of manuscripts at this point. I don't know how to say this to you, but some of you are really bad at grammar and punctuation. And that's not a value judgment, that's just being honest. And you, me, everybody, as a writer, should recognize your strengths and weaknesses, and you really have to attack your weaknesses. That is an unforgivable sin for most agents and editors. In opening 5-10 pages, and it's just rife with errors, they're just not going to bother. They're going to move on to the next manuscript. That is the excuse they're looking for to reject your manuscript and go to the next one. So don't give it to them. You have to shore up these problems. And so one of the things that you should be doing when you recognize your weaknesses, as you're working with beta readers, you should be asking them and prompting them about certain things. I'm going to cover this in a video at some point, like how to work with beta readers and get the most out of that process. But for the time being, I'm going to recommend Woe Is I from Patricia O'Connor. And this is the Grammarphobes Guide to Better English in Plain English. It's a super easy read, and it does a lot, I think, to advance your grammar in general and writing in kind of an easy manner, a modern manner, and getting away from kind of formalized writing that might plague people that, like me, came from like the technical world. And so it's a pleasure to read, and it's easy to digest, so I recommend this to shore up those parts of your writing. And lastly, number 10, we come to Self-Editing for Fiction Writers by Renni, Browne, and Dave King. This is a really good look at what you should be doing as you finish up your manuscript and trying to trim down to the bare minimum. Again, as you learn more about the editing process, the self-editing process, you will start folding in some of those lessons into the writing on the first go. But you have to start somewhere. You have to learn where to trim, where not to trim, and this goes a long way towards advancing that. And so this is another short read, but it's chock full of pragmatic, no-nonsense, nuts and bolts style advice that's going to help you make your stories the best they can be. I hope that list gave you some ideas of some books that might help you, and if you read them, actually do help. Now I'd like to hear from you. I'm always on the lookout for more good books on writing, and I'm sure others watching are too. What are some of your favorites and why? What are some of your other favorite resources outside of books? It could be a podcast, a website, another channel here on YouTube. And I'll go first. I mentioned in these videos several times Brandon Sanderson, who is a wildly successful sci-fi and fantasy writer, and he's posting his creative writing course here on YouTube. I'll have that link in the description below. If you have more, please share in the comments. As always, if you found this video useful, please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, gang, dream big, stay positive, and keep writing. Peace, everyone.